Because of the tragic consequences of child labor, Louis Hines saw a good opportunity to step in and change the lives of these working children for good. With the help of the National Child Labor Committee, Louis Hines was able to use his photographs to implement change in labor practices. These photographs were a triumph for children over factory owners.
Starting in the late 1700s, child labor in factories began increasing rapidly. With the start of the Industrial Revolution, factories had machines that were easy to operate for children. Better done by little girls from 6 to 12 than by grown men, said Michael Bergen. The little children were also smaller, allowing them to squeeze into tight spots more easily and overall doing most things easier. For a full week of work, the kids would only be paid $1 no matter how much work they got done. This resulted in poor families because after the replacement of adults with children in the factories, most families relied on their children to provide for the family. Children in factories began working as young as 5 years old. In 1910, children worked 50 to 70 hours a week, exhausting themselves and developing colds. Many factories were very harsh and had horrific conditions. One glass factory was surrounded by barbed wire, and if the children tried to escape, they were tortured. The children working in the breakers had the worst conditions of them all. They could barely see 5 feet in front of them.
In the mid-1800s, child labor and its major effects were recognized by many groups, such as church reformers, labor groups, and teachers. At least 1.5 million kids were employed, and this number later increased to 2 million in 1900. During the Industrial Revolution, child labor reached an extreme. Some people say, "Oh, they aren't that bad. You ought to see some of the others," said Suzanne Heber, a woman who was against child labor and letting the children work. The extreme consequences of working these dangerous jobs led groups to start a movement for better working hours and better conditions. In 1908, Louis Hines began working for the National Child Labor Committee, also known as the NCLC. The NCLC was the second committee to be constructed to put a stop to child labor. The first was the Alabama Child Labor Committee. The NCLC put its main focus on businesses that employed large numbers of children that were employed under the age of 15, and the ones that worked in hazardous conditions. I was hunted for days by the horror of it when I first saw some of these children who worked in the cotton mills, trying to play after hours. I say trying to play, because they seemed to hardly have the strength to play. Suzanne Heber.
Between 1880 and 1900, the number of children that worked for wages was increased by 50%. In 1908, the NCLC made a decision to enlist the help of Louis Hines to take pictures of the conditions the children faced and to expose the factories. Louis would hide his camera under his jacket and would sneak it into the factories. He would disguise himself as an inspector to get into the factories. Children were robbed of an education because they were always at work, which outraged Louis Hines. Newsies ended up being exposed for abuse by their employers, customers, and sometimes even their own parents. These jobs involved work, hard work, depending on its monotony, exhausting physically. We might even say of these children that they are condemned to work, said Louis Hines. The horrific conditions made Louis Hines come to a decision of taking pictures of these jobs these children had to do, the horrific things they had to go through, and to expose the factories. Louis Hines was long considered to be a preeminent pioneer of American photography because of all of the pictures he took of child labor. Every photo that Hines took, people could see the strength and dignity in the children's eyes while they were at work. Over the next 8 years, Hines traveled through the country and took close to 5,000 pictures. Almost all of the children many of which appeared in the NCLC pamphlets. Lewis's photos were produced between 1908 through 1924. Lewis had one goal in mind: end the practice of child labor. Lewis worked for the NCLC from 1908 through 1913 and traveled around 50,000 miles a year. Factory managers frequently tried to keep Lewis Hines out so he wouldn't be able to expose something that profitable to the public. Hines often pretended to be a fire inspector, salesman, or an engineer sent to inspect the mines, and he would ask a small worker to pose by a machine. If he wasn't able to go inside, he would follow the children early inside the morning before their boss arrived at the factory.
Two boys named Dennis McKee and Arthur Albecker were featured in a newspaper titled "Lad Fell to Death in Big Coal Chute." The unlucky boys fell down the chute while trying to close it. The pictures that Lewis Hines took were posted by the National Child Labor Committee. After the pictures were posted, many people couldn't believe the cruelty that the children went through. These pictures were realized to be graphic evidence that the industrial America was exploiting its children. Lewis Hines personally designed his own pamphlets and booklets on child labor with all the pictures he took. He came up with many new formats for his pictures and words. To describe the new format he was developing, he coined the term photo story. Some of his test photos were made into stereotypical slides for use at illustrated lectures. Lewis Hines' investigative career with the NCLC lasted about 10 years.
The Keating-Owen Act was passed in 1916, but then was ruled unconstitutional in 1918 because it overstepped the government's powers. In the United States, it took many years to outlaw child labor, but many efforts were made to pass national child labor laws. In 1924, Congress proposed the Constitution Amendment that prohibited child labor, but unfortunately, the states did not ratify it. The first child labor bill was the Keating-Owen Act of 1916. This act made working during school illegal for children 14 and up, but after school, they were able to work certain jobs. To work during school, you had to be a minimum age of 16, and for dangerous work, a minimum age of 18. Today, all of the states in the U.S. have laws regulating child labor that cured the worst evils of children working in factories. The first child labor bill, the Keating-Owen Bill of 1916, was based on Senator Albert Jay's proposal from 1906 and used the government's ability to regulate interstate commerce to regulate child labor. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act, also known as the FLSA, was passed, which played an important part in the child labor era. The FLSA established a minimum of 40 cents an hour, a maximum of 40 hours a week record keeping, and child labor standards affecting full-time and part-time workers in the private sector, in the federal, state, and the local governments. Do not let any calamity howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry, said President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt expressed his staunch support for the bill in 1938 during one of his infamous fireside chats. At the time, the act imposed a federal minimum wage of 25 cents.
Due to Hines' photographs, the extremely horrible conditions of the factories that the children worked in led to triumph of the conditions finally being exposed, and the children were finally free. The tragic consequences of child labor faded quickly, and is close to being completely abolished in present day.